The conference room smelled of fresh sawdust and betrayal. I stared at my son David across the polished oak table, his eyes cold as the Portland rain streaking the windows behind him. Rebecca sat beside him, her manicured fingers drumming against a leather portfolio that held my death sentence. The lawyers flanked them like vultures, their documents spread out like tarot cards predicting my doom. "Just sign the papers, Dad," David said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Make this easy on everyone." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I leaned back in my chair, the same chair I'd sat in for 38 years building Mitchell & Sons construction from nothing, and I smiled. That smile seemed to unnerve them because Rebecca's drumming stopped and the lawyers exchanged glances. "You know what's funny?" I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Marcus tried to warn me about you, Rebecca. Said you weren't who I thought you were. Turns out, neither of you are." The room went silent, except for the rain. David's jaw tightened, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, maybe. Good. They thought they had me cornered, but they had no idea what an old contractor could build when his back was against the wall. The morning mist clung to the construction site like a shroud, and I stood at the edge of what would become another family's dream home. At 68, my joints protested the early hour, but my mind was sharp as the day I first picked up a hammer. The coffee in my thermos steamed against the Oregon chill as I watched my crew arrive, their headlights cutting through the gray dawn. This was my world, built on handshakes and honest work, where a man's word meant everything and family came first. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy, my 12-year-old grandson. "Grandpa Hank, can you pick me up from soccer practice today? Dad's busy again." I smiled, typing back a quick yes. David was always busy these days, ever since Rebecca Chen had joined a company 6 months ago. She'd arrived with impressive credentials, a business degree from Stanford, and ideas about modernizing our operations. More importantly, she'd arrived with something else that caught my son's attention in ways that had nothing to do with construction. The rumble of Marcus Thompson's pickup truck interrupted my thoughts. Marcus climbed out, his weathered face creased with concern, and I knew before he opened his mouth that this conversation would change everything. We'd been friends for 20 years, partners on dozens of projects, and I'd never seen him look this troubled. "Hank," he said, pulling me aside from the other workers, "we need to talk, privately." His voice carried an urgency that made my stomach clench. We walked toward the trailer that served as our temporary office, our boots squelching in the mud. Inside, surrounded by blueprints and coffee-stained invoices, Marcus turned to face me with the expression of a man delivering bad news. "It's about Rebecca," he began, then paused, running his hand through his graying hair. "And David." The way he said their names together sent ice through my veins. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I've been seeing things, hearing things. "They're planning something, Hank, something that doesn't include you." I set down my thermos with a deliberate calm that betrayed nothing of the storm brewing inside me. "What kind of things?" My voice was steady, but my hands wanted to shake. Marcus had never been for gossip or drama. If he was bringing this to me, it was serious. Late-night meetings at the office, documents I'm not supposed to see, phone calls that stop when I walk into a room. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo taken from across the street, David and Rebecca entering a downtown law office, their body language intimate, conspiratorial. "This was last Tuesday. You were visiting Sarah's grave, remember?" They told everyone they were meeting with the Johnson Project architects. Sarah, my wife of 42 years, gone 3 years now to cancer. Every Tuesday I visited her grave, bringing fresh flowers and updates about the business she'd helped me build. It was sacred time, and David knew it. The fact that he'd used my grief as cover for whatever scheme he was hatching felt like a betrayal within a betrayal. "There's more," Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower. "I overheard Rebecca on the phone yesterday. She was talking about getting you declared incompetent, said something about age-related decline affecting your judgment. David was right there, nodding along. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My own son, the boy I'd taught to swing a hammer and read blueprints, plotting to have me removed from my own company? The trailer suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. I stood and walked to the window, watching my crew work with the precision and dedication I'd instilled in them over the years. These men trusted me, depended on me. Their families counted on the steady work Mitchell and Sons provided. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my breath fogging the glass. "I started noticing things about 2 months ago, but I think it goes back further. Maybe to when Rebecca first arrived." Marcus joined me at the window. "She's smart, Hank. Real smart. And she's got David wrapped around her finger in more ways than one." The implications crashed over me like a falling wall. David's increased criticism of my methods, his sudden interest in updating our corporate structure, Rebecca's suggestions about modernizing our leadership approach, the way they'd started excluding me from certain meetings, claiming I needed to focus on the big picture while they handled details. It hadn't been optimization, it had been isolation. "What do you think they're after?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mitchell & Sons was worth $12 million on paper, but its real value lay in the relationships, the reputation, the trust we'd built in the Portland construction community. In the right hands, or the wrong ones, that was worth far more. "Everything," Marcus said simply. "Rebecca's been asking a lot of questions about our client relationships, our bidding processes, our margins. She's mapping out the entire operation like she's planning to take it over." He handed me a manila envelope. "I've been documenting what I can. Photos, overheard conversations, meeting notes I found in the trash. I wasn't sure if I should bring this to you, but when I saw them going into that law office..." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were photos, printouts of emails, handwritten notes in Rebecca's precise script. The evidence painted a picture of systematic planning, of a woman who had studied our company like a battlefield and identified every weakness. My age, my traditional methods, my trust in family, my grief over Sarah's death, all of it cataloged and weaponized against me. One email exchange made my blood run cold. Rebecca to David. "Your father's emotional attachment to outdated practices is holding back growth. We need to present this as a generational transition, not a hostile takeover. Frame it as honoring his legacy while securing the company's future." David's response: "He's been different since Mom died. More scattered, less focused. People have noticed." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Sarah's death had changed me, yes, but not in the way they were suggesting. It had made me more aware of what mattered, more determined to preserve what we'd built together. But they were twisting my grief into evidence of incompetence, using my love for my late wife as ammunition against me. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "I think they've been meeting with our competitors. I saw Rebecca having lunch with Tom Bradley from Bradley Construction last week. They looked pretty cozy for people who should be rivals." Tom Bradley. We'd been competing against his company for contracts for 15 years, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always with mutual respect. If Rebecca was feeding him inside information about our bids, our strategies, our client relationships, it would explain why we'd been losing more jobs lately. I had attributed it to market fluctuations, economic uncertainty. I'd been a fool. The sound of trucks arriving for the morning shift filtered through the trailer walls. My crew was starting another day of honest work, building something that would last, something that families would call home. They had no idea that the foundation they trusted, the company they'd helped build, was being undermined from within. I closed the envelope and looked at Marcus, this man who'd risked his own position to warn me. "What do you think I should do?" The question tasted bitter, admitting that I needed advice about my own son, my own business. "Fight," he said without hesitation, "but fight smart. They're playing a long game, using lawyers and manipulation. You need to play a longer one." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He pulled out a business card. Dorothy Williams. She's been handling construction law for 30 years. If anyone can help you navigate this mess, it's her. I took the card, running my thumb over the embossed lettering. Dorothy Williams, attorney at law. I'd heard the name before, knew her reputation for being tough as nails and twice as sharp. If I was going to war with my own family, I'd need someone who understood both the legal battlefield and the personal cost. "Marcus," I said as he prepared to leave. "Thank you. I know this wasn't easy." He nodded, his expression grim. "Hank, I've got 3 kids and a mortgage. I can't afford to lose this job, but I can't stand by and watch them destroy what you've built either. Whatever you decide to do, count me in." After he left, I sat alone in the trailer, surrounded by the plans and dreams that had defined my life. Outside, the mist was lifting, revealing the skeleton of another home rising from the earth. But inside, everything I thought I knew about my family, my future, my legacy, was crumbling like a foundation built on sand. I picked up my phone and dialed Dorothy Williams' number. It was time to start building something new, something they'd never see coming, something that would protect not just me, but everyone who depended on Mitchell & Sons construction. The war had already begun. I'd just been too trusting to realize it. But that was about to change. Dorothy Williams' law office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, its exposed brick walls lined with legal volumes that looked like they'd survived decades of battles. The elevator creaked as it carried me upward, each floor marking another step away from the world I knew and toward a fight I'd never wanted. The receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, directed me to a conference room where Dorothy was waiting. She stood as I entered, extending a firm handshake that immediately conveyed competence and strength. Dorothy was probably in her early 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a navy suit that spoke of serious business. Her office walls were decorated with photos of construction projects, court victories, and what looked like 3 decades of battles won on behalf of contractors and builders. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Marcus Thompson filled me in on the basics when he called this morning. Tell me everything." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd heard every possible betrayal story and wasn't easily shocked. I laid out the evidence Marcus had gathered, watching Dorothy's expression grow more serious with each document. She examined the photos with a magnifying glass, made notes on the email printouts, and asked pointed questions about dates, locations, and witnesses. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. "This is worse than I initially thought," she said. "What you're describing isn't just a power grab, it's a systematic campaign to undermine your credibility and position you as an obstacle to the company's success." She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching what looked like a timeline. "The good news is that their approach, while clever, leaves them vulnerable to several counterattacks." Dorothy explained that Rebecca's strategy relied heavily on perception management, creating a narrative that I was too old and set in my ways to lead a modern construction company. She's betting that if she can make enough people believe you're slipping, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Clients lose confidence, employees start doubting, and eventually you're forced out by consensus rather than legal action. The insight hit me like a cold slap of reality. I'd noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with me lately. Longer pauses before responding to my suggestions during meetings, raised eyebrows when I mentioned traditional construction methods, questions about whether I was considering retirement. I had attributed it to normal generational differences, but now I realized it had been orchestrated. "What's our first move?" I asked, surprising myself with how naturally the word "our" came out. Dorothy smiled, recognizing that I'd committed to the fight. "Information warfare," she said. "They're using whisper campaigns and selective facts. We need to gather our own intelligence and start controlling the narrative." She handed me a list of names. These are people who've worked with Rebecca before she came to Portland. I want to know everything about her background, her methods, her previous business relationships. The list included former colleagues, business school classmates, and executives from companies where Rebecca had consulted. Dorothy's investigative network was clearly extensive, and I began to understand why Marcus had recommended her so strongly. "There's something else," Dorothy continued. "The timeline suggests this wasn't opportunistic. Rebecca didn't stumble into your company and then decide to take it over. This was planned from the beginning." She showed me a calendar marked with key dates. She started her research on Mitchell & Sons 6 months before she even applied for the position. That level of preparation indicates this was a targeted acquisition strategy. The revelation made my stomach turn. While I'd been grieving Sarah's loss and trying to keep the company stable, Rebecca had been studying us like a laboratory specimen, identifying weaknesses and entry points. My son's loneliness after his divorce, my own emotional vulnerability, the company's traditional structure that could be portrayed as outdated, all of it had been mapped and exploited. Dorothy's phone rang, and she took a brief call that seemed to energize her. When she hung up, she was grinning. "That was my investigator. Rebecca Chen has a very interesting history. 3 previous companies, 3 successful takeovers, and 3 former business partners who thought she was their trusted ally, right until she wasn't." The pattern was clear and chilling. Rebecca was a corporate predator who specialized in infiltrating family businesses, gaining the trust of key family members, and then systematically dismantling the existing power structure from within. The personal relationship with David wasn't just convenient, it was her primary weapon. "She's done this before," I said, the pieces falling into place. "My son isn't her first mark." Dorothy shook her head grimly. "And unfortunately, he probably won't be his last, unless we stop this here and now." We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive strategy. Dorothy would handle the legal aspects, building a case that would protect my ownership stake and expose Rebecca's fraudulent behavior. I would work on gathering evidence from within the company, documenting any attempts to undermine my authority or manipulate business decisions. The plan required me to act normally while secretly building our case, a performance that would test every ounce of self-control I possessed. I'd have to sit through meetings with David and Rebecca, listen to their suggestions and criticisms, all while knowing they were actively working to destroy me. As I prepared to leave Dorothy's office, she placed a hand on my shoulder. "Hank, I need to ask you something difficult." "Are you prepared for the possibility that David is a willing participant in this, not just a victim of manipulation?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. I wanted to defend my son, to insist that he was being used and would come to his senses once he understood what Rebecca really was. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The emails, the meetings, the coordinated attacks on my credibility, all of it required David's active participation. He wasn't just being seduced, he was collaborating. "I have to be," I said finally. "Whatever David has become, I can't let it destroy everything Sarah and I built together." Dorothy nodded approvingly. She'd seen too many family businesses torn apart by similar betrayals to have any illusions about the emotional cost of fighting back. The drive back to the construction site gave me time to process what I'd learned and prepare for the performance I'd have to give. The rain had stopped, and shafts of afternoon sunlight were breaking through the clouds, illuminating the skeletal frame of the house my crew was building. It struck me as metaphorical, something taking shape despite the storm. Eddie Rossi met me at the trailer, his expression troubled. Eddie had been my warehouse foreman for 15 years, a straight-talking man who managed our equipment and materials with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. "Boss, we need to talk," he said, echoing Marcus's words from that morning. Inside the trailer, Eddie pulled out a clipboard with inventory sheets.
We've got problems with our material orders. Stuff's been going missing, deliveries that don't match the invoices, equipment that's supposed to be on site but isn't. He flipped through the pages, pointing to discrepancies. At first I thought it was just normal shrinkage, maybe some theft, but the pattern's too consistent. My heart sank as I realized this was another front in Rebecca's war. If she could create inventory problems, cost overruns, and project delays, it would support her narrative that the company was poorly managed and needed new leadership. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "About 2 months," Eddie said, "right around the time Miss Chen started taking more interest in our operations. She's been asking a lot of questions about our supply chain, our vendor relationships, our inventory controls." He lowered his voice. "Boss, I think someone's been feeding information to our competitors. We've lost 3 bids this month on jobs we should have won easily." The scope of the sabotage was becoming clear. Rebecca wasn't just trying to position herself as the solution to problems, she was creating the problems in the first place. It was elegant in its ruthlessness and devastating in its effectiveness. "Eddie, I need you to start documenting everything," I said. "Every missing item, every discrepancy, every unusual request for information, and keep it quiet. Don't discuss this with anyone else, not even Marcus." Eddie nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation without needing explanations. That evening, I sat in my kitchen reading through more of the evidence Dorothy had provided about Rebecca's background. Her pattern was consistent across 3 different companies, always the same progression from trusted outsider to indispensable insider to new owner. The previous victims had all been family businesses, all led by older founders who'd built their companies from nothing. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dad, can we talk? Rebecca has some ideas about expanding into the commercial market that I think you'll find interesting. Dinner tomorrow?" The message felt loaded with hidden meaning, another trap being prepared. But this time, I'd be ready. I texted back agreeing to dinner, then called Dorothy to let her know about the meeting. "Perfect," she said. "This gives us a chance to see what they're planning next. Remember, act interested, but don't commit to anything. We need them to feel confident while we gather more evidence."
The next 24 hours would test whether an old contractor could outmaneuver 2 people who'd made manipulation their profession. But as I looked around my kitchen, at the photos of Sarah and me building our life together, at the drawings Tommy had made of construction sites, I knew I had something they didn't understand. I had roots, history, and people who believed in more than just profit margins. The war was escalating, but I wasn't the same man who'd walked into Dorothy's office that morning. I was becoming something Rebecca hadn't planned for, something her research hadn't anticipated. I was becoming dangerous. The timber lodge sat nestled among Douglas firs on the outskirts of Portland, its rustic exterior hiding the kind of private dining rooms where serious business was conducted away from prying eyes. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained by decades of construction schedules, and chose a corner booth that offered clear sightlines to both entrances. The server, a college-aged kid with paint-stained fingers, brought me coffee that steamed like my breath had that morning in the cold trailer. David and Rebecca arrived together, their body language immediately telling me everything I needed to know about their relationship. The way she touched his elbow while speaking, how his eyes sought her approval before he made decisions, the synchronized timing of their movements, it all confirmed what Dorothy's investigation had suggested. This wasn't just business, it was personal, and that made it both more dangerous and more vulnerable to disruption. "Dad?" David said, sliding into the booth across from me while Rebecca settled beside him. "Thanks for meeting us. I know you've been resistant to some of our modernization ideas, but I think what Rebecca's prepared will change your mind." His tone carried the practiced patience of someone addressing a stubborn child, and I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. Rebecca opened a leather portfolio, revealing charts and projections that looked impressive at first glance. "Hank, I've been analyzing our market position, and there are tremendous opportunities in the commercial sector that we're currently missing. Her voice was smooth, confident, the tone of someone accustomed to convincing rooms full of executives. As she spread out her presentation, I noticed details that my untrained eye might have missed a week ago. The data was selectively chosen, emphasizing potential profits while downplaying risks and required investments. The timeline was aggressive to the point of being unrealistic, and the financial projections assumed market conditions that were optimistic at best. The residential market is becoming saturated, Rebecca continued, pointing to a graph that showed declining profit margins. Commercial construction offers higher revenues, longer-term contracts, and the opportunity to establish Mitchell & Sons as a major player in the Portland development scene. She slid a contract across the table. I've already had preliminary discussions with Cascade Development Group. They're interested in partnering with us on a mixed-use project downtown. I picked up the contract, noting immediately that it was far more detailed than any preliminary agreement should be. This wasn't exploratory. It was a commitment that would fundamentally alter the company's direction and expose us to levels of risk we'd never undertaken. More troubling, the financial structure heavily favored Cascade Development, suggesting either inexperience or intentional disadvantage in the negotiation. "This is moving pretty fast," I said, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced through the implications. Commercial construction requires different expertise, different insurance, different everything. We'd be basically starting over in a field where we have no track record. David leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way that reminded me painfully of the boy who used to help me fix things around the house. "That's exactly why we need fresh thinking, Dad. You've done amazing things with residential, but the construction industry is evolving."
If we don't evolve with it, we'll be left behind. His words echoed conversations we'd had about updating our equipment, modernizing our office systems, adapting to new building codes, all reasonable changes that I'd implemented over the years. But this felt different, like evolution was being weaponized against tradition. Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "The beauty of the commercial market is that it rewards innovation and efficiency over established relationships. It's a merit-based environment where the best ideas win, regardless of how long someone's been in business." Her emphasis on "how long" felt deliberate, another subtle reinforcement of the age-based narrative she'd been building. The server returned to take our dinner orders, providing a natural break in the conversation that allowed me to study their faces. David looked excited, energized by possibilities that I suspected he didn't fully understand. Rebecca looked calculating, her eyes constantly moving between my reactions and the documents spread across the table. She was reading me like a blueprint, looking for stress points and structural weaknesses. "There's another element to consider," Rebecca said as our meals arrived. "The commercial sector offers opportunities for vertical integration. Instead of just building structures, we could get involved in development, financing, even property management. It's a chance to build generational wealth, not just a construction company." The phrase generational wealth hung in the air, loaded with implications about who would be part of that generation. I cut into my salmon, buying time while I processed what she was really proposing. Vertical integration meant complexity, capital requirements, and dependencies that could sink the company if market conditions shifted. It also meant moving away from the hands-on, relationship-based business model that had sustained Mitchell & Sons for nearly 4 decades. "What about our current employees?" I asked. "Eddie and his crew, Marcus and the guys who've been with us for years. Commercial work would require different skills, different equipment. Are we planning to retrain everyone, or are we talking about essentially replacing our entire workforce?" David shifted uncomfortably, and I knew I'd touched on something they hadn't adequately considered. "We'd need to make some personnel adjustments," Rebecca admitted. "The commercial sector rewards lean operations and specialized expertise. Some of our current team members might not be the right fit for the new direction." Her clinical language couldn't disguise what she was really saying. The people who'd helped build Mitchell & Sons would be discarded in favor of efficiency metrics and profit margins. The conversation continued over dinner, with Rebecca painting increasingly elaborate pictures of future success while David nodded along with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found both a business partner and a romantic interest in the same person. I asked careful questions, expressed measured interest, and played the role of a traditional business owner slowly being convinced by modern thinking. But inside, I was cataloging every detail for Dorothy's investigation. The rushed timeline, the exclusion of existing employees, the financial terms that favored outside partners, all of it painted a picture of someone trying to transform Mitchell & Sons into something completely different before anyone could object or ask too many questions. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said as we finished our meals. "The Cascade project would require some restructuring of the company's ownership and management structure. Nothing dramatic, just modernizing our corporate governance to meet commercial sector standards." She pulled out another set of documents, these even more complex than the development contract. I scanned the papers, noting clauses about management authority, decision-making processes, and profit distribution that would effectively remove me from operational control while maintaining the illusion that I was still involved. It was elegant in its deception, legally sound, while being practically devastating to my position.
"This seems like a big step," I said. "Maybe I should have Dorothy Williams take a look at these documents before we move forward. She's handled construction law for 30 years, knows all the potential pitfalls." Rebecca's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that suggested my mention of legal review was unexpected and unwelcome. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Though I should mention the timing is critical with the Cascade opportunity. They're evaluating several potential partners, and delays could cost us the contract." David nodded agreement, adding pressure to the artificial urgency she'd created. As we prepared to leave, David walked to the restroom while Rebecca and I were momentarily alone. She leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Hank, I hope you know that everything I'm proposing comes from a place of genuine respect for what you've built. Mitchell talks about you constantly, about the lessons you taught him, the example you set. I just want to make sure that legacy continues to grow." Her words were perfectly chosen, acknowledging my achievements while subtly suggesting they belonged to the past rather than the future. But there was something else in her tone, a hint of steel beneath the silk that reminded me of Dorothy's warning about Rebecca's previous victims. They'd probably heard similar speeches right before their companies were taken from them. "I appreciate that, Rebecca," I said. "Sarah always said the best way to honor the past was to build something even better for the future." I watched her face as I mentioned my late wife, looking for any sign that she understood the deeper meaning of my words. What I saw was the quick calculation of someone adjusting her strategy in real time. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where Mitchell & Sons had built dozens of houses over the years. Each one represented a family's dreams made tangible, craftsmanship that would outlast generations, relationships built on trust and delivered promises. Rebecca's commercial vision offered none of that continuity, none of that human connection that had always been the real foundation of our success. Back in my study, I spread out copies of all the documents Rebecca had presented and began making detailed notes for Dorothy. The pattern was becoming clear. Isolate the founder, create urgency around new opportunities, restructure the company to remove traditional authority, and execute the transition before anyone could mount effective resistance. But as I worked late into the night, I felt something shifting inside me. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they were being joined by something more useful: anger. Not the hot, destructive kind that led to poor decisions, but the cold, calculating anger that had gotten me through combat in Vietnam and the early years of building a business from nothing. Rebecca Chen had made one critical error in her research. She'd studied Mitchell & Sons as a business entity, analyzed its financial structure and market position, mapped its personnel and relationships, but she'd failed to understand what she was really up against:
a man who'd spent 68 years learning that the most dangerous battles are fought not with force, but with patience, preparation, and the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect what matters most. The war was about to enter a new phase, and I was no longer just defending. I was preparing to attack. The Portland Business Journal arrived with my morning coffee, its headline making my blood run cold. Mitchell & Sons Construction eyes major commercial expansion. The article, written with insider knowledge that could have only come from Rebecca, painted a picture of an aging company finally embracing modern business practices under new leadership guidance. My name appeared 3 times, each mention emphasizing my traditional approach and gradual transition toward retirement.
I hadn't agreed to any public announcement, hadn't approved any press statements. Yet here was our supposed business strategy laid out for every competitor, client, and industry observer in the Pacific Northwest to read. The timing was deliberate, designed to force my hand by creating public expectations that would be difficult to reverse without appearing erratic or unstable. My phone started ringing before I finished the first paragraph. Frank Cooper, one of our oldest clients and a family friend for over 20 years, was the first to call. "Hank, what's this about moving into commercial work? You thinking of dropping residential customers like me?" His concern was genuine, tinged with the worry of someone who'd relied on our relationship for 2 decades. "Frank, you know better than that," I said, trying to keep frustration out of my voice. "That article got ahead of itself. We're exploring opportunities, not abandoning our foundation." But even as I spoke, I realized the damage was spreading. By lunch, I'd fielded 17 calls from worried clients, confused employees, and curious competitors, all wanting to know if Mitchell & Sons was abandoning its core business. The masterstroke of Rebecca's strategy was becoming clear. She wasn't just trying to change the company's direction, she was using public pressure to make that change inevitable. Every client who called expressing concern, every employee who questioned our stability, every competitor who started circling like vultures, all of it created momentum that would be nearly impossible to resist without appearing to damage the very company I was trying to protect. Dorothy's call came at 2 in the afternoon, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Have you seen the journal article? This is escalation, Hank. She's forcing a crisis that will require immediate resolution." I could hear paper shuffling in the background, the sound of someone working at maximum intensity. "I need you in my office within the hour. We have to accelerate our timeline." The drive downtown felt different this time, less like seeking help and more like reporting for duty. The city streets seemed sharper, the autumn light more focused, as if the world had shifted into a higher state of alertness. In Dorothy's conference room, she'd spread out documents that looked like battle plans, flowcharts showing corporate structures, timelines mapping legal procedures, contact lists of witnesses and allies. "Rebecca made a tactical error with this article," Dorothy said, pointing to the newspaper. "She's revealed her hand too early, shown that she's operating without your approval. That gives us grounds to challenge any decision she's made that exceed her authority." She slid a thick folder across the table. My investigator finished his background check. Rebecca Chen isn't just a serial acquirer, she's a predator with a very specific pattern. The folder contained photocopied court documents, bankruptcy filings, and testimonials from 3 business owners whose companies had been systematically stripped of assets before being dissolved or sold. Each case followed the same progression: infiltration, isolation, manipulation, and acquisition. The legal paperwork was complex, but the human cost was clear in the handwritten notes from victims who'd lost everything they'd built. "Here's what we know," Dorothy continued, spreading out a timeline. "Rebecca targets family businesses in transition, usually following the death of a spouse or key founder. She identifies the emotional vulnerabilities, the relationship dynamics, the financial pressure points. Then she inserts herself as the solution to problems she's often created herself." One case file made my hands shake as I read it. a 70-year-old furniture manufacturer in Sacramento whose wife had died of cancer, leaving him struggling to maintain both the business and his relationship with an adult son who felt entitled to immediate inheritance. Rebecca had appeared as a consultant, promised modernization and growth, and within 8 months had engineered a hostile takeover that left the founder with nothing but a small pension and a non-compete agreement that prevented him from working in his chosen field. The Sacramento case is our template.
We know her methods, her timeline, her legal strategies, but more importantly, we know her weaknesses. She pulled out a different set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of various law firms and regulatory agencies. Rebecca's previous acquisitions involved irregularities that were never fully investigated because the victims lacked resources to fight back. We're going to be different. The plan Dorothy outlined was comprehensive and ruthless. We would challenge every decision Rebecca had made that exceeded her consulting authority, document every instance of her acting on behalf of Mitchell & Sons without proper authorization, and expose her pattern of corporate predation to industry regulators and law enforcement. But the centerpiece of our strategy was something I hadn't expected, a counteroffensive that would turn her own methods against her. She's been using David's emotional attachment to manipulate business decisions, Dorothy explained. We're going to force her to choose between maintaining that relationship and protecting her financial interests. When people like Rebecca face that choice, they almost always reveal their true priorities. The specific mechanics of the plan required me to play a role I'd never imagined. The grieving widower, slowly succumbing to age and pressure, making increasingly erratic decisions that would force Rebecca to either support me publicly or reveal her true intentions. It meant appearing weak when every instinct told me to project strength, accepting criticism when I wanted to fight back, allowing my own reputation to be questioned in service of a larger strategy. "Can you do this, Hank?" Dorothy asked. "Can you let people think you're losing your grip, even temporarily, if it means saving the company?" Her question cut to the heart of my identity as the leader, a builder, a man who'd spent decades earning respect through competence and reliability. "If it protects what Sarah and I built, I can do whatever it takes," I said, surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "But I need to know that the people who matter, the people who depend on Mitchell & Sons, will be protected when this is over." Dorothy nodded, her expression softening slightly. "The employees who've been loyal to you will be taken care of. The clients who've trusted you won't be abandoned, and the legacy you and Sarah created will survive." She gathered up the documents, organizing them into neat stacks. "But Hank, once we start this process, there's no going back. Rebecca will realize what's happening and escalate her own efforts. Things are going to get ugly before they get better." That evening, I called a meeting with Marcus and Eddie at the construction site. The skeletal frame of the house we'd been building was now enclosed, its rooms taking shape in the gathering dusk. We sat on sawhorses in what would become the living room, surrounded by the smell of fresh lumber and the promise of another family's future happiness. "I need to ask something difficult of both of you." I began explaining the situation without revealing all the details of Dorothy's plan. "There are going to be rumors, questions about my judgment, maybe even suggestions that I'm not capable of running the company anymore. I need you to know that whatever you hear, whatever appears to be happening, I'm still fighting for Mitchell & Sons." Marcus and Eddie exchanged glances, their weathered faces reflecting decades of trust in my leadership. "Boss," Eddie said finally, "we've seen you handle everything from labor disputes to natural disasters. If you say you're fighting, then we're fighting with you, regardless of what anyone else thinks." Their loyalty was both humbling and terrifying. These men were risking their own careers on faith in my ability to navigate a crisis unlike anything I'd ever faced. But as we sat in that unfinished house, surrounded by the evidence of honest work and shared purpose,
I felt something crystallize inside me. Rebecca had studied Mitchell & Sons as a business, analyzed its weaknesses, and crafted a strategy to exploit them. But she'd missed the essential truth that bound everything together. This wasn't just a company, it was a community. The relationships, the trust, the shared commitment to building something lasting, all of it represented values that couldn't be quantified in her spreadsheets or manipulated through her psychological tactics. The next morning, I implemented the first phase of Dorothy's plan. I called David and asked for a meeting to discuss the journal article, my voice conveying just the right amount of confusion and hurt. When he arrived at the office, I was sitting at my desk, looking older than my 68 years, surrounded by newspapers and legal documents that suggested a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. "Dad, I'm sorry about the article," David began, his tone mixing genuine concern with rehearsed explanations. Rebecca thought the announcement would help generate interest from potential commercial clients, create momentum for the expansion. His words carried the sound of someone repeating arguments he'd been given rather than expressing his own thoughts. "I just don't understand why we're moving so fast," I said, allowing my voice to waver slightly. "Your mother and I always believed in careful planning, making sure we understood the risks before committing to major changes." The mention of Sarah hit its target, and I saw David's expression shift toward the guilt and grief that Rebecca had been exploiting. "Mom would have wanted us to grow, to build something bigger," David said, but his conviction sounded forced. She believed in taking calculated risks when the opportunities were right. I nodded slowly, as if accepting his interpretation, while internally noting how thoroughly Rebecca had coached him to weaponize his mother's memory. The performance continued for an hour, with me playing the role of a confused old man struggling to adapt to modern business realities, while David gradually revealed more details about Rebecca's plans than he'd intended. By the end of our conversation, I had confirmation that the commercial expansion was just the first step in a complete restructuring that would remove me from operational control within 6 months. As David left, I sat alone in my office, the weight of deception heavy on my shoulders. Playing weak when I felt strong, appearing confused when I was thinking clearly, accepting disrespect when I wanted to demand accountability. All of it went against every leadership principle I'd learned in 68 years of life. But Dorothy's plan was working. Rebecca's confidence was growing, her moves becoming bolder and less careful. And somewhere in the shadows of corporate law and regulatory oversight, the foundation was being laid for a counterattack that would expose her predatory methods and protect the company I'd spent decades building. The war had entered its most dangerous phase, where victory and defeat balanced on the edge of a blade that I was learning to wield with surgical precision. The emergency board meeting was called for Friday morning, Rebecca's voice urgent when she phoned late Thursday night. "Hank, we need to discuss some irregularities Dorothy Williams discovered during her review of the commercial contracts. There may be some compliance issues that require immediate attention." Her tone carried manufactured concern, the sound of someone creating a crisis to justify drastic solutions. I arrived at the conference room to find not just David and Rebecca, but 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, their briefcases positioned like weapons on the polished table. The morning light streaming through the windows felt harsh, unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across faces that had once seemed trustworthy. "Thank you for coming, Dad," David said, avoiding my eyes. "We've discovered some problems with how the company's been handling certain financial obligations. Nothing criminal, just oversights that could expose us to regulatory penalties if not addressed quickly." His rehearsed words carried the weight of someone delivering a prepared script. Rebecca spread documents across the table with practiced efficiency.
"The commercial expansion requires clean compliance records. Unfortunately, some of our traditional practices don't meet current standards." She pointed to highlighted sections of contracts, invoices, and regulatory filings that painted a picture of careless record-keeping and outdated procedures. I recognized the documents immediately as ones Dorothy and I had prepared specifically for this moment. Every supposed irregularity was carefully constructed to appear legitimate while being easily disprovable with proper legal analysis. But to untrained eyes, they looked damning enough to justify emergency action. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my voice carrying just the right amount of weariness and confusion. The lawyers leaned forward, sensing opportunity in what they perceived as an old man's capitulation to overwhelming circumstances. "Temporary management restructuring," Rebecca said smoothly. "David would assume operational control while we work with regulatory authorities to resolve these issues. You'd retain ownership, of course, just step back from day-to-day decisions until everything's cleared up." Her words were honey over poison, offering face-saving measures that would effectively end my control forever. The first lawyer, a thin man with predatory eyes, slid a thick contract across the table. "This document formalizes the transition and protects everyone involved. Sign here and we can begin damage control immediately." His pen clicked impatiently as he pointed to signature lines that would sign away everything I'd built. I picked up the contract, my hands trembling slightly as I turned pages filled with legal language designed to confuse and intimidate. The trembling wasn't entirely an act. The moment of truth had arrived, and even with Dorothy's careful planning, success wasn't guaranteed. "This seems very complicated," I said. "Maybe I should call Dorothy Williams, have her explain what I'm signing." "Dad, we don't have time for extended legal review," David interjected, his impatience genuine. "The regulatory deadline is Monday. If we don't act now, the penalties could bankrupt the company." His words carried desperation I hadn't heard before, the sound of someone realizing their carefully constructed timeline was slipping away. Rebecca's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, if you prefer to wait and let lawyers drag this out while the company faces regulatory action, that's your choice. But I should mention that Cascade Development has indicated they may withdraw their offer if our compliance issues aren't resolved by next week." The manufactured urgency was textbook Rebecca, creating artificial deadlines to prevent careful consideration of life-altering decisions. But this time, her pressure tactics were walking directly into the trap Dorothy had prepared. I set down the contract and looked at each face around the table, memorizing expressions that would soon change dramatically. "You know what?" I said, my voice gaining strength. "I think I'd rather risk the regulatory penalties than sign something I don't understand." I stood slowly, gathering my dignity like armor. "This meeting is over." Rebecca's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath the professional facade. "Hank, you're making a serious mistake. The evidence of financial irregularities is overwhelming. If you won't cooperate voluntarily, we may have to pursue other options." "What kind of other options?" I asked, though Dorothy and I had anticipated exactly this moment. The second lawyer opened his briefcase, revealing documents that would declare me mentally incompetent and transfer control of Mitchell & Sons to David under Rebecca's guidance. "We've documented concerning behaviors, erratic decision-making, confusion about basic business operations, resistance to necessary modernization. Medical professionals would call it age-related cognitive decline." Her words were delivered with surgical precision, each one designed to justify the legal assassination of my competency. David looked uncomfortable, but didn't object, his silence a final confirmation of how completely Rebecca had corrupted his judgment.
"Dad, we're just trying to protect you. Protect the company Mom helped you build," he said, invoking Sarah's memory one last time as justification for betrayal. I smiled then, genuinely, for the first time in months. "You know what's funny about all this?" I said, reaching into my jacket. "Marcus was right. Rebecca really isn't who I thought she was." I pulled out my phone and pressed a button that connected me to Dorothy's office. "Mrs. Williams, this is Hank Mitchell. Yes, they just threatened to have me declared incompetent. You can release everything now." The room went silent, except for the sound of Dorothy's voice, confirming that fraud investigators, regulatory authorities, and local media had simultaneously received complete documentation of Rebecca's criminal pattern of corporate predation. Rebecca's face went white as she realized her carefully constructed web was unraveling. "What have you done?" she hissed, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. The lawyers frantically gathered their papers, recognizing legal disaster when they saw it approaching. "I protected what my wife and I built," I said simply. "Every conversation we've had for the past month was recorded. Every fraudulent document you created was cataloged. Every lie you told about my competency was witnessed and documented." I stood straighter, feeling decades of doubt and fear lift from my shoulders. David stared at me in shock, finally understanding that the confused old man he'd been manipulating was actually the experienced businessman who'd outmaneuvered opponents for nearly 4 decades. "Dad, I didn't know. I thought she was trying to help. I never meant for it to go this far." "I know," I said, my voice softening slightly. "But intentions don't rebuild trust, son. Actions do." The weight of lost relationship hung between us, a bridge burned by choices that couldn't be undone. Rebecca was already heading for the door, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling lawyers who specialized in damage control rather than corporate acquisition. By Monday morning, the Portland Business Journal ran a very different headline. "Fraud investigation exposes corporate predator targeting local businesses." Rebecca Chen was facing criminal charges in 3 states, her previous victims finally finding the resources to pursue justice.
Mitchell & Sons remained under my control, stronger for having survived the attack. Marcus found me that afternoon at the construction site, watching my crew put the finishing touches on another family's dream home. "So what happens now, boss?" he asked, settling onto a sawdust beside me. I looked out at the Portland skyline, at the city where I'd built a life, raised a family, and learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with hammers and blueprints, but with patience, preparation, and the willingness to appear weak until the moment comes to be strong. "Now we build," I said simply, "same as we always have." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.